Welcome to week 11, everyone. It's exciting. We've got, 3 weeks left before the exam, then the exam in week 14, and then break, and then final week, we got presentations. Speaking of presentations, I've started grading the AI deliverable part one. For the most part, I've been really impressed. Seems like everybody kind of took it to heart and they were doing something that was personally interesting to them and they wanted to learn more about it. It's always there's a tension there because I always want students to do something interesting and fun, but something that also has some research depth. But for the most part, I've been pretty impressed with everything. I haven't seen anything where I just thought somebody kind of phoned it in. So looking forward to getting to grade some more of those. I've gone through about half of them right now, maybe a little bit less than that. Before we get started, let's go ahead and talk about a few things that I think might be of relevance to you. So first and foremost, I mentioned this last week, but I mentioned that there was a job opportunity in Enterprise Bank and Trust. I actually went on to Handshake. I do have Handshake access and looked at different opportunities for internships in the spring. Sorry, the summer. There are a lot of them. If you've not signed up for Handshake yet and gone on there, if you're looking for a position for the summer, like an internship, as I think most people in this class probably are looking for, if you're not graduating already, I would strongly encourage you to do so. This is about the peak recruiting time is this point in time right now. Is this where they're looking at people to come in? So please make sure you take advantage of that. Also, I'm going to got a couple announcements that are relevant for the accounting majors. For those who are not accounting majors, I apologize, but I do need to take a couple of items away. So first of all, if you haven't heard already, Ruben Brown will be actually here on campus recruiting tomorrow. So please make sure you take an opportunity to go speak with them. They're also doing a meet and greet over at Wooden Nickel, which will be from 4 to 6 p.m. tomorrow. I have really high regard for Ruben Brown. They do a really good job of recruiting, and they're very big fans of Truman State graduates. So think about that. Also, there's a scholarship that I don't know that we take as much advantage of as we probably should. So I wanted to make an announcement. I'm going to make it my auditing class too. So I'm going to try to reach out to all the accounting students I can, but it's going to be for the Missouri Society of CPA scholarship. They give about $40,000 away annually in scholarships, and it's usually $500 to $1,000 scholarships to students. I do think that we could actually get more scholarships if we have more applicants. We have one student that's consistently got the scholarship, and he may be one of the few people that's been applying for this. So I encourage you that if you're looking for free money, most of you should be, take advantage of applying for this scholarship. I don't think it'll take a lot of your time, and the rewards that you could benefit are pretty great in that. I think most of the people in this room have got at least a year left. If you're planning on graduating, obviously don't try to apply for the scholarship if you're not doing any more education. But I think most people are looking for at least a year more. All right. So real quick, before we start on today's topic, we have our schedule coming up. I just want to reiterate what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks. So we've got lectures this week, next week, and the week after. And then I said week 14 is our second exam. So be aware of that. At the end of week 13, which I believe is the 14th, Friday the 14th, your professional interaction is due. And so hopefully you've started thinking about that. If you have not already attended an event that would be applicable for your professional interaction, there are a couple of those coming up. We do have one this coming Wednesday. It's going to be our TrueBiz Forum that will take place from 3:30 to 5 o'clock over in VH 1000, a big event. They're going to be talking about AI, which is very relevant to what we've been talking about in this class. So I think this will be an interesting opportunity for many of you. If you can't attend that event or would like to attend something different, we have our executive residence coming up, I think, next week. I don't remember the exact date and time. The third, yeah. Okay, 12:30 to 1, so or something along those lines. But yeah, we've got some opportunities coming up for professional interactions. Those are not exclusively the only events that you can attend, but you do need to attend at least one event to write up on it, and that's going to be due at the end of week 13. Also, please keep in mind the end of week 14, your next AI deliverables due. You have to submit that before you start working on your presentation, which is going to be the final week. I do believe, I didn't bring this up. I probably should have brought it up, but I believe that I've already added a link on Brightspace for sign-up dates for the final week. We have 27 students that are here on the in-person class session. So that's going to be approximately 9 students per class period presenting. I believe it's 9 students in the first 2 class sessions, and I did 8 students in the final class session. which sounds like a lot, but keep in mind that these are really short presentations. They're intended to be very short. It's going to be like 3 minutes of presentation and then 2 minutes of questions and answers. So we're going to get through them really quickly. We should be able to finish in 40 or in 50 minutes without any problem. So if you have a preference on which to sign up for, please do so. My particular request for this, and this is really important for those of you who are student athletes or have big events that are going to be coming up in the final week of the semester, if there is absolutely a date that you cannot present on, don't sign up for that date, okay? Now, you may say that's probably given that I wouldn't do that, Dr. Barnes, but this has happened in the past, is that somebody has waited until the last second. They only had one date possible that they could sign up for, and that was a date that they couldn't present on. So if you have a conflict during that final week, please sign up early. Make sure you take the initiative and take that care of that. And if it just comes to it that you can't get a date that you can present on, come talk to me. We'll work something out. All right, so today is what I call this is kind of a trifecta of special interest chapters. So I will say that from a student perspective, you're probably going to enjoy the last two chapters far more than this chapter. All right. This is personally my favorite chapter because well, first of all, I'm a really boring person, okay? I like very simple things. I like cheeseburgers. I like watching or playing on a computer. I don't really get into complex stuff. So I have very, very low level of interest. So that's kind of partial explanation. But I also am an auditing professor, so I have a unique interest in internal controls. We're going to talk in depth about AIS and internal controls today. We already have some acquaintance to this. We've already talked about in controls pretty much throughout the semester, but we're going to dig down a little bit deeper. So a couple of points of caution. If you brought yourself an energy drink, you may want to drink that before we start here, okay? Because this stuff gets really, really boring and tedious after a while. Secondly, there will absolutely be some detailed questions of this on the exam. I think this stuff is extremely important. It does not matter what area of business you go into. Everybody is expected by controls. So I'm going to have a lot of questions here. There will be some points here I'm going to say, this will absolutely be on the exam, and it will absolutely be on the exam. And in past semesters, students have not believed me when I said it was absolutely going to be on the exam, okay? They did not sufficiently study it for the things that I said will absolutely be there. So if I say something's absolutely going to be on the exam, you should take that as an initiative of please study that in great detail to make sure that you are prepared for it. All right. With that, let's talk about internal controls. All right. So the complex definition of internal control is a process to design and provide reasonable assurance that management objectives related to the quality of data, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, and compliance with applicable laws and regulations will be achieved. So that sounds very, very technical, and it can be technical in a lot of context. We can look at controls and see what are the details, what are the nuances. There's a lot of depth that we can go into, far more depth than we're going to go into today. But I like to keep things fairly simple and straightforward when we talk about the nature of internal controls. And we've already talked about that already in this course. My simple definition is a control is a response to a risk. As organizations, we are subject to risks. Organizations are going to be subject to risks in their environment and their operations. We need to be able to identify those risks and, as necessary, respond to those properly. So today we're going to talk about what are some of the things that we need to consider as we think about these risks and our proper response to them. So let's go into a little bit more detail. So broadly speaking, the goals of internal control are to, first of all, safeguard assets. Secondly, maintain sufficient records. Next, provide accurate and reliable information. This is actually a really important one, which is a component of the framework we're going to be discussing here shortly. We also want to prepare financial reports according to established criteria. Now, this one gets a little bit overlooked, but this is something that you should be familiar with. So the very first accounting course you took was Introduction to Financial Accounting, and hopefully you have some memory of that. I've talked about it a little bit in this course. But the Introduction to Financial Accounting was very heavily focused on financial statement preparation. Does that everybody remember that? Preparing the income statement, the balance sheet, the statement of cash flows. What is the purpose of preparing those financial statements? Is it just to make college students in business miserable? That's it, Dr. Barnes. You hit the nail on the head. So yeah, depending on how much you like the statement of cash flows. I personally love the statement of cash flows because it gave you such a warm feeling when you got all the lines right, okay, and everything balanced out. But that's not the goal. What was the goal of this? Well, keep in mind that there are two parties. There's the owners of the organization and there's the people who operate the organization. And they're not the same they're not the same entity in some situations. So how do the owners of the organization fix the problem of not knowing what's going on with their organization? And the answer is they require the organization to prepare and present financial statements. These are reports to external parties saying, here's everything that went on during the year that you need to be aware of. And it's summary information, but it's very detailed summary information. This is a control in the most basic sense of the word. We risk the fact that if we own an organization or if we're stakeholders in an organization, we don't know what's going on with that organization. So our solution is to prepare these financial reports so we do in fact know what's happening. Also, it says to establish criteria. If we're talking about the way that most public organizations operate in the United States, what is the name of that established criteria? What was the name of the standards that you had to follow back in financial accounting? Yep, generally accepted accounting principles. So that's all that we mean by established criteria is we're saying, what are the financial reporting framework that we're operating according? Now, our default is going to be GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, but there's many different frameworks we can operate according. And depending on the size of the business, it's going to change the operating framework we're using. Also, promoting and improving organizational efficiency. This is something that our visitors from Spire Energy a few weeks ago, they were actually talking about. That's part of their goal there, is to make sure that operations within the organization are effective, and we make sure that we're doing everything that's possible to not only just do things, but do them in the best possible manner. And this is a big part of internal operations organization. Encourage adherence of management policies and comply with laws and regulations. This is another one that gets overlooked, but a really important one, especially if we're talking about heavily regulated industries. You can't just do whatever it is you want to achieve a result. You have to follow the rules. So we want to make sure that that's a part of controls as well. And we're going to have components associated with this. And you will notice that these kind of broadly fall into one of three categories. What have to do with financial reporting, they have to do with internal operations, or they have to do with compliance with laws and regulations. And that's it purposeful. There's actually a reason for that. We'll see here shortly. So we've already talked about three categories of internal control, but I want to reiterate these points very clearly because this is really important. And this is the area that I'm going to focus on this. I've talked about them at a very general level, but I think it's important to talk about them very specifically today. So three categories of internal controls. Now, I do want to throw the caveat out there, and I've said it previously. There's three categories, but broadly speaking, it's two categories because two of these categories are going to be used jointly together. We generally do not see them operating independently. It's not true 100% of the time, but it's going to be true most of the time. So our first category of controls is going to be preventive controls, all right? And this is basically saying we want to stop problems before they occur. We want to stop problems before they occur. So an example of this would be authorization of transactions. Remember back in the revenue process, we said that credit authorization was one of our first steps in the revenue process. And what was the goal of credit authorization? Why did we even go through that step? We wanted to make sure that anybody who we authorize credit to will actually pay us back. We want to avoid the problem of extending credit to a customer and them saying, okay, we have no money, sorry. We want to extend credit to entities that are creditworthy. So authorization of transactions is trying to avoid a problem before the problem could ever occur. If we identify good companies that we know that will be creditworthy and will pay us back consistently, then we can avoid problems from taking place. That's an example of a preventive control. By the way, you may hear me use the word preventative. I say those interchangeably, but they are interchangeable. Preventive or preventative, either one. Then we have detective controls. These basically identify problems or discover problems that are not prevented. So is it possible to have good preventive controls? Yes. Is it possible to have perfect preventive controls? The answer is no. The simple truth is we're human beings. We make mistakes. We can't prevent every single possible problem that exists. So we need to have other controls, redundant controls, considered to be how we detect problems from occurring. So is anybody taking 302 with Dr. Eisen? I know I've asked this question before, okay? So remember those bank reconciliations? Yeah, bank reconciliations, they're so much fun, you know? If you don't enjoy them, then I apologize. You're gonna have to start doing reconciliations for your own personal benefit in the future, okay? That's called being an adult. Adulting is one of those things that you have to detect. So when you pull out your credit card statements and you say, all right, I did this transaction, I did this transaction, what? Trip to Florida? Okay, no, that would be an example of a detective control. You're trying to identify problems that occur. And then you immediately get on the phone with the bank and say, okay, cancel this $1,000 charge. I did not fly to Florida. Okay, by the way, if you did fly to Florida and actually took a spring break trip there, don't call the credit card company. That's fraud, okay? So yeah, trying to identify problems before they occur. So example of this in accounting context is just those bank reconciliations, but a credit card review that you would do personally, that would be another example of a detective control. Now, here comes the joining of the things that I talked about before, the joining of the particular control areas. So I said that two of these controls are used jointly. When I talk about that, I mean detective and corrective controls are generally used jointly. So if you identify a problem, is that the final step that you need to take? No, if you identify a problem, you probably also want to fix the problem, which is why we consider corrective controls to be jointly used with detective controls. So corrective controls, they correct and recover from the problems that have been identified. So an easy example of this, extending from our possible situation, is that if you're reviewing your credit card transactions, you see I did not engage in this credit card transaction. I did not buy a luxury yacht off the coast of Aruba. Okay, which if you've got that extension of credit, kudos to you. I mean, yeah, if you can afford that luxury yacht to go to your credit card. But yeah, if you identify a problem, then you say, I need to fix the problem. I'm calling my credit card company and saying, yeah, this luxury yacht's not mine. I don't know who bought it, but it's probably a very small yacht given my credit limit. All right. So go ahead and fix the problem and figure it out. So an example of one that we could use as a more tangible example for an actual operation of an entity would be backup files to recover corrupted data. Was anybody here when the data or the ransomware attack occurred here at Truman State 2 years ago? Okay, so I'm dealing with somebody who's just like saying, there was a ransomware attack, Dr. Barnes? Yes, back in spring 2023. We did have a ransomware attack, and it was basically a big problem because we had operated for about like 2 weeks without any computers, which if you want to talk about trying to take exams at that time, that was a problem. That was an issue. So what did Truman State do? Did they pay the ransom? The answer is no. Okay. IT was very, very diligent about keeping archived copies of whatever was on the network and making sure they could reuse them. And they just use those archived copies, which is effective, by the way, because we were actually able to recover most of the work that we did during that time period. It also means that whenever you log in and you have to actually go to that Duo authentication service, that was actually one of the results because they started using multi-factor authentication. So if you hate this Duo service, you can thank the ransomware attackers, okay? Or you can say something nasty about the ransomware attackers is probably more apropos. They're the ones who made us do multi-factor authentication. So yeah, that's an example of how we would recover in a situation, how we'd correct a problem is that if something happens. We're going to look at a little bit more of some examples in that regard in another chapter, but for the most part, we're going to keep it at that for right now. So something else we would need to reiterate is something we've talked about previously. This was something we talked about at the end of chapter 7 after we talked about revenues. We've talked about two areas or two broad categories of controls over information systems. Our first category was general or access controls. So remember the controls that we talk about are relevant to what an employee can access. That was kind of our catchword that we talked about back in the day, as we said, anything that's relevant to what an employee can access. Those are access controls. More specifically speaking, this limits who can access an information system in the areas of information accessible to each user. So these pertain to enterprise-wide issues, which are controls over accessing the network, developing and maintaining applications, and so on and so forth. Now, our definition really hasn't changed, but has expanded somewhat. Basically, this does not have to be restricted to employees. It could be any number of individual stakeholders in the organization. We just like to use employees as an easy way to identify this. I'm not going to make that much more complex than this, but it's still kind of the same concept before is what is it that we can access from the system and what is it that we can do with that access? That is kind of the key point. Again, my example that I talk about with NetSuite is that we have almost unlimited access in NetSuite right now because we have administrator privileges. In the real world, we would not have that. We would be limited to a salesperson privilege or to a credit authorization role, something along those lines that would be limited in scope, which is why I harp on that when we go through this, saying, keep in mind, this is a different individual that would be doing this task from the one that was previous, because that's the kind of access control that would be in place in a system like that. Then we have our application controls, which again, when we talked about application controls, this was system responsibility. This is what the system does in response. So this is an automated process, provides detail for data activity and an audit trail. And so, by the way, I don't know if I've done an effective job of talking about this, but when I use the term audit trail, I'm not talking about something that's exclusively used for an external audit. An audit trail in this context is more of a general term, saying this is an item that we use to actually fix or find a problem that went wrong and fix it. Just basically a path that we can follow to figure out what's happening. So it's specific to a subsystem or an application to assure the validity, completeness, and accuracy of the transactions. In other words, if we see a problem, then we find or we identify what the nature of the problem is, how far it extends, and we try to fix that problem. Now, if you remember, we talked about this earlier in the semester, but I want to reiterate this point. In the previous slide, we talked about preventative, corrective, and detective controls. Access controls tend to be primarily preventive in nature. It's not exclusive, but for the most part, our access controls are going to be preventive. We want to stop the problem from ever occurring. Our application controls tend to be detective and corrective in nature. If we see a problem, we figure out what the root of the problem is and we fix it. So that's how those line up. Now, is that true in 100% of scenarios? Absolutely not. Is it true in about 90% of the scenarios? Probably higher than 90%, probably most scenarios we look at. But that is an easy way to think about these, is these are going to be primarily preventive and then detective and corrective down here. All right. So has everybody got a good comprehensive understanding of internal controls? Great. All right. We can call it a good from here. Just ignore the rest of the slide. Actually, let's not ignore the rest of the slides. Let's talk about something else. Okay. So something that you may or may not be familiar with. Let's talk about these companies right here. Has anybody ever heard of these companies? Probably heard of the Big E over here. Big E, Enron. How about WorldCom? Has anybody ever heard of WorldCom? Has anybody heard of Anderson? If you heard of Enron, you probably heard of Anderson. Okay. So Anderson was actually the public accounting firm that served as external auditor for both Enron and WorldCom. And one of the problems that Anderson had is that they were very, very heavily influenced by a lot of what Enron and WorldCom were offering them. They offered them large sums of money for a lot of the work. Now, it's not necessarily relevant what we're talking about today, but one thing that we do need to note is these were three companies that were at the top of their fields back in the early 2000s that basically don't exist today. Okay. Now, the reason I say basically don't exist is because there's actually small sliver of Enron that still exists, as well as Anderson. To my knowledge, WorldCom is just gone. Okay. But these companies basically disappeared within a very, very short window. It was like 2002, they were at the top of the field. 2003, all gone, completely and totally absent. But one thing that was very, very prevalent with respect to these organizations is that they had very, very poor control infrastructure. I mean, extremely poor control infrastructure. And this was a problem that was identified by Congress. So in 2002, Congress said, in response to the financial scandal at Enron and the financial scandal at WorldCom, the lack of oversight by Anderson, as well as a whole bunch of other problems that occurred right around that time period. There were a bunch of them, by the way. There were a lot of frauds that came to light right around that time frame. In response to that, we are going to pass sweeping legislation that's going to change the scope of financial reporting in the United States. Does anybody know what that act is called? The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, okay? Also known as SOX, okay? Which, by the way, if you're not familiar with SOX, get familiar with it. It actually still affects the way that we operate today. So the goal was to improve the transparency of corporate disclosures issued by publicly traded companies. In other words, basically the information that was being provided by these organizations was extremely opaque. It was very hard to tell what was going on in an organization. Example, Enron. Enron was operating according to these things called variable interest entities. Now, how many people have ever heard the terms variable interest entities? If you have, you've probably been studying Enron, okay? I will tell you, I've been studying accounting for going on a little over 30 years now. I still cannot tell you exactly what a variable interest entity does, all right? And that's after about 15 years of exclusive research in accounting. It is extremely difficult to follow. So the whole goal of this is to say, let's make it make sense to the people who are outside of the organization. It also established the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board to oversee auditing of publicly traded companies. So the PCAOB, if you're an accounting major, you're going to hear a lot of that because we talk about that all the time in auditing. Okay, it's going to affect a lot of the rules that we follow. But what was it that we need to know about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that's relevant to this course? And the answer is it mandated a few important areas related to organizational controls. First of all, it actually strengthened something called corporate governance. Now, you've probably heard the term corporate governance in some form or another, whether you realize it or not. Usually, when we talk about corporate governance, we're talking about a subset of the board or of the shareholders. Oftentimes, in organizations, this is going to be referred to as the board of directors, but can refer to other groups that are under that purview, such as the audit committee. But these are the organizational policies and procedures that safeguard stakeholder interest. The whole reason for having a board of directors is to have some representatives of the owners of the organization that make sure that the company is acting in the best interest of the shareholders, of the owners of the company. Also, it actually helps out auditor oversight during high quality independent audits of financial statements and internal controls. So what does that mean? It means that the auditors now have strengthened responsibility and they have increased oversight over the work that they're going to be doing. And it actually changed the face of the way the things worked. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that because this is not an auditing course, but there's a lot of things that you can actually delve down into there. Also, while not a direct result of Sarbanes-Oxley, many organizations have incorporated something called a code of ethics to define and promote organizational values. Now, we like to think that corporations are generally going to be very high valued and they're going to operate in the best interest of their stakeholders. This was not something that was actually very common back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Basically, there were a lot of executives who were doing what they could to kind of act in their own self-interests and not operate according to what was the best interest of the stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, I'm not exclusively referring to shareholders. It was just anybody who had an interest in the organization. Code of ethics is much more relevant now, especially when they're entering the area of ESG. So everybody heard the term ESG before? So yeah, environmental, social, and global. We want to make sure it's in the best interest of all stakeholders, not just the owners of the company. All right, so that was 2 slides that were completely and totally irrelevant except for superficial things to this chapter, but I'm getting to the whole point. Within Sarbanes-Oxley Act, there's a section called 404, Section 404, and this specifies management's responsibility with regard to the design, implementation, and maintenance of internal controls. Basically, in the past, organizations kind of thought of controls as an afterthought. If a control existed, great. If a control did not exist, things would be fixed in the ending during the financial reporting process. Now, if it's a publicly traded organization, companies have a responsibility to implement proper internal controls, especially those that relate to financial reporting. Now, it's not to say other controls are not important, but they are not as prominent because they don't relate directly to the financial reporting process. So this is area that was defined under Sarbanes-Oxley Act, saying management, you have responsibility to create controls in these areas. These controls better be good because you're going to be judged on them. There's also some audit responsibilities, but we'll talk about more of those in 417 if you decide to join me for that. Okay. So what are some things that we need to specifically know about? The answer is we need to talk a little bit about corporate governance and what that entails. Now, with respect to internal controls, corporate governance entails primarily 2 areas, one of which we're going to go into a lot of depth about, another which we're going to talk about very broadly. So organizational governance, we got 2 frameworks, and they're both part of this group called this Committee on Sponsoring Organizations, or COSO. So what we are going to go into a lot of depth in is this thing called the COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework. This is the most widely used framework for internal controls globally, and it's very, very specific in its definition of its approach to internal controls. Now, please make a note of this. Remember earlier when I was saying you have to know something for the final exam, and or for the next exam, I'm going to tell you specifically what you need to know. This should be a big red flag right here on this, okay? This particular framework is one that I think is extremely important because everybody in this room will encounter it to some degree or another when they go out to the real world, okay? Unless you decide to retire immediately out of college and grow tomatoes on a farm, that's about the only scenario. And even then, there's going to be some sort of governance mechanism, okay? Even then, there's going to be some governance mechanism. Now, relevant to this is going to be the COSO Enterprise Risk Management Framework. This one is a little bit more broad, and I'm going to talk about it at a very high level. This one is not going to be as important. We do need to discuss what it represents, but for the most part, I don't think it's as relevant to internal controls because it's not specific to internal controls. So let's go ahead and get into detail. What was it we're going to be concerned about with respect to framework or to controls? So we got this right here, and I kind of preempted it because we're not quite there yet, but I do want to talk really quickly about information technology governance as well. So the Securities and Exchange Commission also requires publicly traded companies in the United States to evaluate internal controls based on information technology governance frameworks as well. So there are 3 we're going to talk about, and for the most part, your responsibility for these 3 frameworks are to know what their names are, and the initials are just fine, by the way. You don't have to know the exact names, okay? So what their initials are, and you need to know what the purpose of the framework is, which we're going to get to here very shortly. So 3 frameworks: control objectives for information and regulated technologies, which is COBIT, information technology infrastructure library, ITIL, and information organization, international organization for standardization, ISO 27000 series. Okay. So by the way, couple things to note. You will need to know that it is specifically the 27000 series because there's a lot of different iOS standards that are relevant in this area. So you need to know that. Secondly, you may be asking if it's International Organization for Standardization, why is it not iOS? My best answer for this is actually a European institution that we adopt and use in the United States. If you translate this to French, I believe the way that it's pronounced or it's actually stated is ISO. So that's why it's International Standard. All right, why it's ISO for International Organization for Standardization. Okay, let's get into COSO 2013. So this is the most widely adopted control framework. I say in the United States, I believe this is worldwide. It's the COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework. Now, this is a picture of the COSO cube. And I do want to talk about the three faces of the COSO cube and what they represent. Two of these faces are far more important than the others. Okay, so the one that's less important is going to be this side face right over here. So this is the organizational structure. Basically, all this means is the controls can affect different levels of the organization. Okay, so if you consider a specific control, you can think about it's going to affect certain components of the organization and maybe not the organization as a whole. Something like a code of ethics, which could be viewed as an internal control, would be an example of an entity level control. Everybody in the entity is affected by that particular control. Whereas we're talking about a functional control, that might be the controls that operate at a store level, so like our entity level. So an example would be is management has the ability to open a cash register if a transaction needs to be canceled or something like that. So an example of Taco Bell being able to cancel transactions or give refunds as necessary. Is that relevant to the organization as a whole? No, because not everybody is a store level manager. That would be more of a functional control. Could be something that's going to be at the operating unit or at the actual role itself. Those are fairly intuitive. Those are fairly self-explanatory. We're not going to go into a lot of depth of that. You do not need to memorize this face of the COSO cube. You don't need to memorize those. You don't need to know what those are because, again, they're relatively explanatory just based on the role. What you do need to know is you do need to know the front face of the COSO cube and the top of the COSO cube. So let's go ahead and talk about them in detail. So let's talk first about the top face of the COSO cube. So this actually outlines the objectives of the COSO internal control framework. And there are three objectives that are going to be relevant here. There's the reliability of financial reporting, the effectiveness and efficiency of operations, and the compliance with laws and regulations. Now, have we seen this already in this lecture? Obviously, yes, because I wouldn't ask that question otherwise. But where did we see it? Remember when at the very beginning, when I was going through all the different objectives of controls and I was saying all those different items and I spent like 5 minutes talking about those. And I said, these can be categorized in basically one of three ways. And I said, reporting, operations, or compliance. The way that we think about controls is controls are going to do generally one of three things. They're going to facilitate financial reporting. They're going to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of internal operations of the organization, or they're going to be in place to make sure that we're following the rules in our industry. They're going to make sure we're compliant with laws and regulations in the industry. Now, can a control be operating in more than one area? Probably, okay. But for the most part, that's how we categorize controls. So you need to be responsible for knowing all three objectives. And again, this is one where I'm not going to focus so much on trying to identify whether a control falls in a specific area, because again, that's mostly intuitive. If we talk about a control like something that relates to financial reporting, like okay, making sure that account balances get reconciled on a timely basis. That would be very obvious because I've said account balances, which is what we report in financial reports. If I talk about making sure that the factory floor gets cleared on a regular basis, I get to say that's pretty obvious. That's operations. So it's not that difficult to identify what category they fall within, which I'm not going to focus on that, but you do need to know the three categories of controls in this regard, the three objectives of controls. Where my focus and my emphasis goes into is going to be the next one. These are called the components of internal controls. Now, this is the one area of the lecture that I think that you need to take the most focus on. This is one of the things that I think is the most important to understand, because this is the foundation of how controls are created and reconciled, basically. In other words, if you do not know these 5 components of internal controls, you cannot implement and maintain effective controls in an organization. So there are 5 components: control environment, entities, risk assessment, control activities, information communication, and monitoring. By the way, those are sequential components, in my personal opinion, that you do have to follow that sequence in order for effective controls to be in place. Now, what do these all mean? What do these all mean? I'm glad you asked, because we're going to go in depth and detail on those. Now, before I go into detail, let me caution you. This is an area of emphasis that I've frequently talked about on previous exams. You do need to know these items. And by the way, when I say know, I'm not saying you need to memorize these 5 categories. Knowing goes far deeper than just memorizing the 5 titles, okay? you need to know what each title represents. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that and going into that depth. So first of all, we have control environment. Control environment, in my personal opinion, is the most important component of the COSO framework. And basically what it represents the control environment that's characterized by the actions and attitudes of the individuals who lead the organization. We often use the term tone at the top to characterize this particular area. So it represents management philosophy, operating style, the organization's commitment to integrity, ethical values, and competence, internal control oversight by the board of directors and the audit committee, and any methods of assigning authority and responsibility. Now, that's all very technical, but what does it mean? All right, what do these terms mean? I put them in the slide, but what does it represent? Let's go ahead and use an example from this classroom and try to see if we can understand. So let's say that I'm working through an assignment and we're preparing for the exam, and I'm kind of giving you some guidance on the exam. Somebody raises their hand and say, Dr. Barnes, can we bring a note card in that has some of this information on for us to help us with the exam? And if I give you the answer, no, that would be considered academic misconduct. I would consider that as cheating. You are welcome to ask me questions. I encourage you to study really hard, but you cannot use any outside notes. I've sent a very clear signal to everybody in this room of what my impression is about your conduct on the exam. Can we agree to that? Okay. So you know, based on my conduct, based on my tone, what the expectations are. Let's change the scenario. Let's say the same question comes up and you say, can we use a note card? I don't care. Go ahead, do whatever you want. What tone does that set? Well, first of all, everybody's going to be writing on a note card really, really quickly, okay? But does it also set the possibility that people might say, well, if he doesn't care about that, he probably doesn't care if I use my phone as well. Or I could be talking to somebody else during the exam. I could probably get away with whatever I want. Does everybody understand the problems with that? If you set a clear tone, if you set a clear example, if you take things very seriously from the get-go, then it sets expectations for everybody else in the organization. If you don't do that, then nobody else will adhere to conduct, regardless of how good the policies are. So you have to set the tone at the beginning. Has anybody ever watched the TV show Shoresy? He likes to say that a lot. He likes set the tone, okay? Actually, he uses an expletive in the middle of that, but I'm not going to do that, okay? So set the tone, all right? Set the tone. Next step is going to be entities risk assessment. So identifying and analyzing potential risk to organization, both internal and external. Process involves determining what relevant risks exist, assessing the likelihood occurrence of these risks, estimating significance, and deciding on how to manage them. All right, again, very technical terminology, but let's think about this. How did I define controls early on? What was my simple terminology to identify what a control is? It's what? A response to a risk, okay? So by logic, just by any rough logic, in order to implement a control, you have to know what is the risk. So this is the step where we identify what are the risks that are present to an organization. We identify what risks are present, and we figure out how significant are they. Now, this likelihood of significance is pretty important because we could identify any array of risks. I could say, well, I'm going to start up a business where I'm going to sell mops to people, okay? But I'm worried that my business may go out of I may go out of business because a meteor could hit my store. Is that a risk? Yes. Is that a relevant risk? Probably not. The likelihood of that happening is very low. Last time a significant meteor hit was about 65 million years ago, okay? That's probably a much bigger risk than I'm promoted to face out of my mop selling store. By the way, if you're asking why did he choose to selling mops, that was the first thing that popped to mind. I couldn't figure out what. I could have sold anything. Probably cheeseburgers would have been more appropriate given my proclivity for them, but I said mops, okay? So anyway, we identify what the risks are and we address them and figure out ways to address them, okay? So logically speaking, first of all, we identify the risks. Once we've identified the risks, we've got to figure out on how to manage them. What is going to be our next step? That is going to be the third component, which are control activities. Control activities are the policies and procedures to address and manage identified risks. So I want you to think about it this way. These are the controls themselves. We've identified a problem. Now we have to figure out how to address that problem. What was my example that I used early on? Okay, my example that I used early on is I risk hurting my feet if I walk outside barefoot. My control, wear shoes. Okay, shoes are a control, which again, I know I've ruined shoe shopping for some of you, which I apologize for, but I think it's a very, very tangible example. It's important to note. I don't know, maybe I say controls are shoes and that's not an appropriate terminology because some people wear really, really weird shoes that don't really protect their feet. In fact, they cause harm to the feet. Like I see my nieces wearing Crocs all the time and I say, those can't be good for the feet, but apparently they're comfortable. Is anybody a big fan of Crocs? I've never worn them. Okay, I'm just too old and just too set in my ways. But anyway, yeah, the Crocs could be viewed as a control, but depending on how comfortable they are. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. So when we think about the physical controls, with traditional controls, we have authorization of transactions, documents of record, safeguard over assets, and segregation of duties, which says CAR. What does CAR stand for? Custody, authorization, or recording. Custody of assets, authorization of transactions, recording of transactions. Three, our responsibilities have to be separated out in an area of responsibility to make sure, or a process area, to make sure the legitimacy of transactions that occur in that area. Okay, so traditional controls. We also got our IT controls, which we've already talked about. Our general and access controls and our application controls are all examples of this. Now, there's a reason I brought up the whole shoe scenario, okay? We've got an idea of what the control is going to be, okay? So we have designed a control that we think will be relevant in addressing the risk. That is our first step, but we still have additional steps that we have to take, because even if we have a control in place, it's possible that we could have a problem. For example, if I know that I need to wear my shoes whenever I go outside to check the mail, but I fail to do it, is the control going to be effective? No. So not only do we have to consider that control has been created, but we also have to make sure the control is being followed, which is going to be basically the focus of our final two steps. So our fourth component is information and communication. So information and communication support all the control components by conveying details and responsibility over internal controls. Okay. So these can be internal, so employees, departments, managers, and governance, or external, customers, suppliers, regulators, and shareholders. What does this mean? It means that a control is going to only be effective if everybody knows what they're supposed to do with respect to controls. All right. So let's say you're responsible for figuring out my control problem with respect to my feet. And you say, well, Dr. Barnes needs some good shoes because he's got really, really delicate feet for some reason, even though he's really, really old. Maybe it's because he's old, he's got delicate feet. So I'm going to put some shoes in front of his door. And I open my door and say, shoes. And then I go and proceed to walk out and check my mail without putting the shoes on. It has not been communicated what the purpose of those shoes are. All right. Again, I realize this is a really silly scenario, but I'm trying to convey the importance of this. If you write a note, say, Dr. Barnes, I bought these shoes for you, put them on before you go and check the mail. That is a much more effective process than just throwing them in my door and saying he'll know what to do with them. I mean, logically speaking, I should know. I think I've lived on this planet long enough to know what shoes are for. But if you convey the information, that's going to be important. This is really important in an organization. You can create a control, but if the people who are responsible for that control don't know what their responsibilities are, is the control likely to be successful? Probably not, okay? So this is the reason why information and communication is so important. Why do I include external stakeholders in here, by the way? Why do I include external parties? Is it possible that you can have external parties that are responsible for controls? Obviously, because they're in the slide, but what would be an example of that? So there's some easy examples. If we think about third-party outsourcing, organizations that do services for our company, we have to make sure their controls are good too. If they've got bad controls, it doesn't matter how great our controls are. If they have a problem, then it's going to leak over into our system. What about shareholders and stakeholders? Well, shareholders like customers and suppliers. If they don't follow processes, like we say, we only accept credit cards, or we only accept credit cards or electronic payments, and they keep sending us cash, are there likely to be problems with that? Can cash get stolen? Let's answer a very easy question. Yes, it can. Very easy. It's a very liquid asset. It's very, very subject to theft. So we might extend this to our customers. We don't want you losing your money. Please do not send us cash. All right. So easy examples of how we would actually implement controls, both internally and externally, with respect to communication. Our final one is going to be something that's going to be addressing responses to risk. So is it possible that risks change over time? Can anybody think of a tangible example where risks change fairly quickly? I can think of a very good one. I was here, okay, in March of 2020. I think most of you were probably in school at the time. Did you have a pretty big change in your education environment during March 2020 to where you were sitting in a classroom and all of a sudden you were sitting in front of a computer screen full time? Yeah, the pandemic created a big problem. It created a new risk that did not exist previously. How do we actually respond to risk is really important, and that's going to be the underpinning of this concept called monitoring. The ongoing evaluation, design, effectiveness, internal controls by management. We learn what risks have changed, and we address changes in controls accordingly. So if I address a risk at the beginning of the life of the organization, if I move 30 years ahead, it's likely that those risks have changed, particularly in this day and age where the pace of change can actually change from day to day. Like I mean, I literally remember I was talking to Dr. Caden. She said, okay, it's likely that we won't be coming back after spring break. And I said, oh, you're overstating things. And then guess what? We did not come back after spring break. Actually, I did because I still worked here, but the students didn't come back for spring break. They were said, stay home. It was actually a big fiasco because we had a lot of students that were in dormitory housing. They couldn't actually get into their rooms. It was really, really crazy. But yeah, we need to understand what risks are present and how risks change over time and address those accordingly. These findings should be evaluated, communicated in a timely manner, and modifications should be made as needed. So does everybody understand those 5 components and how they relate to one another and how they fit within this framework? If the answer is yes, good. Make sure you study these and are prepared for these because this is an area of emphasis for the exam. If you don't, if you're kind of halfway listening, you're going to be watching this video again, okay? Preparation. This is an area of important emphasis for the exam. This is one that I think is really important. All right. So moving forward, we're not going to go into much detail on the COSO ERM except to note a few expanded ways in the COSO 2013. It provides a broader view on risk management to maximize firm value. This is the actual diagram that's in the text, and here's what I want to tell you about this diagram. Don't use it, okay? This is an outdated diagram. The COSO ERM framework actually looks like this now. Effectively, all it is just an expansion of the COSO internal control integrated framework. It's got similar 5 component areas. The only major difference that we want to talk about with respect to the COSO or ERM is that fact that it focuses broadly on firm value rather than risk management. Okay, which makes sense because what is the focus of any organization to go in business? When you go into business, you're trying to say, I want to generate value, whether it be monetary value or some other intangible value. But any organization that goes, like if you're an organization that goes into business to do something other than achieve value, you're probably in the wrong line of business. So we want to make sure that we achieve value in our business lines. All right, last thing I want to talk about. We're going to do it really quickly because I don't have much time. What is COBIT? What is ITIL? What is ISO 27000? COBIT, it's a framework for IT governance and management. It enables IT to maximize firm value, that resources use responsibility and risk are managed appropriately. This is a broad control framework over IT that just makes sure that any IT resources that are wholly handled by the organization have focus on the objective of maximizing firm value, as we just talked about, okay? Usually this is going to be monetary, but it can mean something else if we get really into the nitty-gritty. Next, we've got ITIL, the Information Technology Infrastructure Library. It is a framework for providing IT services and establishing the scope of service management. So we know that organizations are going to provide services, and we want to make sure that we have the best way that IT can provide services for the organization. It actually has 5 high-level categories. You do not need to memorize this diagram. All you need to know is that ITIL is a focus on IT service management, how we can best utilize our IT resources for the functions that we need for the organization. Our final one is the ISO 27000 series. This is about information security. This is more focused specifically on the risks that we talked about before. And basically, the ISO 27000 series, it actually creates something in organizations called an Information Security Management System, an ISMS. The key component being is that information security is a key focus of this. So information is going to be a prominent area of risk to any organization. We want to make sure that anything that's used is kept proprietary to the organization or kept private as necessary. So those 3 are kind of the higher level view that we need to know about that. That's really all you need to know in this area. All right, we're at class time. We'll be back for next week on Wednesday. See you all then.